As the nation continues to grapple with the coronavirus, another worry begins to emerge. How to buoy the economy, not to mention all the impacted workers and businesses. The effort, as you know, it's already underway. But the question is it working and working fast enough? And for that, we turn to Jared Bernstein. Vice President Joe Biden's chief economist, and he was right there during the implementation of the 2009 Recovery Act. He's now a senior fellow at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Jared, always good to talk to you. Thanks for the time.
My pleasure, Richard.
Listen, we're seeing unemployment numbers that make your jaw drop, and we all know they're not even the full picture because all the claims haven't been able to be processed yet. Some people already suggesting we may be heading to another depression. Ray Diallo said that, and you know, he's not exactly a guy with a tinfoil hat. The 2008 recession, we know it began in the housing sector and it spread. How does what you're seeing in the economy today, as a point of context, compare to what we were dealing with in 2008?
It's a lot worse. I mean, we have been looking at layoffs thus far that are close to 17 million, and that's in the course of like 3 weeks. In the Great Recession, we ultimately lost far fewer jobs than that, about 9 million, and that was over a much longer time period. I do think that the appropriate comparison is closer to the Great Depression, although there are important differences. In the Great Depression, the unemployment rate topped out at something like 25 to 30%, and that's maybe higher than we're going to see now. I mean, I've seen forecasts that go up that high, but I'm thinking maybe the unemployment rate peaks at some number closer to 20%. But I think the most salient difference, hopefully, and this has a lot to do with getting the health response to this right on the testing and tracing side, is that it will last considerably less long relative to either the Great Recession or the Great Depression. That doesn't mean I foresee a bounce back. It doesn't mean that 6 months from now we're going to be looking at the very same economy we had before we got into this mess. We won't. But if we play our cards right again on the health care side, on the containment side, we could be gradually moving back to where we need to be by then.
And Jared, my next question deals with some of the expectations I think that you're touching on the public, I don't think is getting prepared enough for. To that end, we know, obviously, there's money ready to go out with T, as in trillions. You've seen billions allocated to small business through the SBA, billions more for workers who will get that directly. But we've already seen major hitches in both systems as to who's eligible for that help, when they're going to see the money, and how, from your perspective, and you were there firsthand, and it wasn't perfect, but we're dealing with something now where I think people are opening up their mailbox waiting for the check every day. From everything I'm hearing, and you're better to answer this than me, we're talking many weeks from now that people won't see anything because the rollout just hasn't gone, it was never going to go perfect, but it hasn't gone remotely well enough.
I'm afraid that that's mostly true. Especially when it comes to unemployment insurance, the PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program, which is relief for small businesses, and checks to households. But I think the problem with the Trump administration is that they've never really had governance and functionability and sort of, making sure things are implemented efficiently. That's never been at the top of their list. It's much more about politics and creating the impression that good things are happening and disparaging their opponents. You know, we can get into all that political stuff. But I just think that the idea of efficient, effective implementation isn't one that comes naturally to this administration. And it's one thing to legislate, and I actually applaud both Congress and the administration for legislating these measures so quickly, but you can't turn away then and just assume implementation. That has to come from the top as well.
And you said there's like three parts to this. One is people may pass it, but to implement it, you got to have somebody, at the top of the food chain here within the administration, so that everybody, you don't, go around to 12 different committees. If the person speaks, people then act. But then they got to do, and you talked about Then Vice President Biden, he was involved on the granular level here. He wasn't just a figurehead. He made sure it got out. But then you said, then you got to have somebody else that's checking that it's being spent, the money, and it's being spent wisely. Jared, we just fired the inspector general here. Nobody, and I don't care even if you're a Trump supporter, had a lot of faith that there wouldn't be potential abuse with this crowd. To that end, it's crazy when we're talking about the amount of money now and we're firing the person. We needed more than an IG to watch this volume of dollars. Aren't you really concerned that the wrong people are going to be getting the money and the right people that need it most won't see it first?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm very concerned about that, but I'm particularly concerned that we won't even know the answer to that question because we're not going to have adequate oversight. That's exactly what I meant when I said implementation has to start at the top. It is essential to have a high-ranking, visible public official. It was Vice President Biden in the implementation of the Recovery Act back in 2009, who is accountable, for whom the buck stops. And you'll hear Trump not only saying, oh, I'll take care of the oversight myself, or that the buck doesn't stop here, it's up to the states to make sure it works, or even worse, I'm going to fire the inspector general that we just fought about putting in charge of this thing because initially Republicans and Trump didn't want anybody doing oversight. So this is all terrifically worrisome, but I'd also argue that it's completely consistent with a politics that focuses not at all on governance and just focuses so much on just imagery and tweeting and all the rest.
I'd be remiss, Jared, if I didn't ask about your old boss. How does somebody who's now the presumptive nominee, obviously, how do you campaign, or more specifically, draw distinctions on how you would handle a pandemic, both from the health but also from the fiscal side, without seemingly being ghoulish at a time of a crisis? Can you do both right now? Does he have to wait until, we're into the fall for this? I mean, people are looking at, well, what would Biden do if he was here now? How do you navigate those two?
Well, I think Biden has every right to explain to interested viewers what he sees going right and wrong, especially as someone who's had such deep experience in this sort of implementation we've been talking about throughout our discussion. So I think, again, not to overuse the walk, chew gum metaphor, but I think that it's possible, and I would actually say integral, for the vice president to get out there and explain in ways that don't at all begin to, undercut the administration in any way, what he sees going well and what he would do differently.
Jared Bernstein, good stuff. Thank you very much for the time. I appreciate it.
My pleasure, Richard.
Up next, you can't separate politics from the virus these days, but we're going to try. As today marks the first full day of the general election campaign, so how does Joe Biden stack up against Trump? Numbers and our first 2020 electoral vote map next.